Hey, so I'm David Thompson. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to everybody. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about modeling skirmish level engagements in wargaming. And I'm going to actually be going through a couple of different case studies. One is specifically limited to skirmish level. And when I say skirmish level in this context, from a wargaming perspective, I'm talking about having an individual counter represent a singular person, right? So even below tactical level. But I'm also going to provide the first case study where I'm really going to focus on the intersection of skirmish level and how it's how that type of engagement can be facilitated by tactical and operational level support. So I'll go to the first slide here. And a little bit about myself. So I'm David Thompson. A few different things here that I've annotated that sort of contribute to who I am as a war game designer specifically. So my professional background, I'm an intelligence analyst. I started with the Air Force, did that for a few years, and then I've been working as a Department of Defense civil servant ever since. Almost all of that time has been working directly with the military, doing military intelligence. I'd say I'm a military history enthusiast. That really is a relatively recent thing, maybe in the last 10 to 15 years. And most of my interest is centered around World War II because of the ties that I've had to the work I've done with war game design and military history. When I look at designing these skirmish level games that I work on, World War II is sort of my sweet spot, and there's a few reasons for that. One, to get the level of detail required for that type of engagement where you want to dig into the personal histories of lots of different people at that level, it's hard to go back much further than World War II and get that level of insight oftentimes. And then I don't really feel super comfortable working on modern day engagements at that level. It's pretty close to home. And there's also this sort of, it can be kind of a murky area. As I said, I work in military intelligence, and I have to keep my sort of day job distinct from my hobby, sort of semi-hobby of wargame design. And then my outside of war games, I also do hobby game design in general. Some of those definitely not mass market, but hobby games outside of war games. One thing I do have listed there is on the hobby game designer side is 9 collaborative partnerships. And that's something I'm really proud of. I do a lot of co-design work. And then some of those co-design relationships are the person I'm teaming with is a historian that's specifically involved with the conflict I'm working on. Or in one of the case studies, the artist and graphic designer is also steeped in geospatial analysis, which was helpful in that study. Okay, this is a very, very high level view of my general process when I'm doing any sort of war game design at all. I start with a design question, roughly equivalent to like a research question you would think of. There's a long period of conducting the initial research. Now, research could actually be listed throughout all of this, right? Because regardless of what phase I'm in, there's always that likelihood that I'm going to go back and need some amplifying information. But there's a dedicated phase for it there early on. Deconstruction of the issue, right? So there's a point where I say, okay, I've conducted the research. Now I need to deconstruct this into something where I can build out the model, which is the next phase. And then finally, after all of that's done, is when I actually start on the game design. So I always lead the research. I let that lead me to what the game design is ultimately going to be. So the first case study, and I teased this a little bit. The first case study I wanted to talk to everybody about is Pavlov's house. And this is not strictly a skirmish level engagement. There's a part of the game that features that, but most of what we're going to talk about tonight is the model that was developed to talk about what operational elements had to exist to facilitate a skirmish level defense of a strong point. And so I wanted to start here with a quote from Antony Beevor. If you probably know Antony Beevor, a very famous author. He's done a lot of different popular military history books. If you've read one book on Stalingrad, it's very likely it's his. I won't read this quote to you. I'll let everybody take just a moment to kind of read over it. But the reason I included it is because if you're reading his very popular book on the Battle of Stalingrad, there's about a half page dedicated to Pavlov's house. And if you read this and you left that book, what you would read about Pavlov's house is very wrong. There's a lot that's incorrect in this passage. Pavlov's house, despite the name of the building, it was named after a sergeant, Sergeant Pavlov. He was there at the building. He led a storm group team that took the building. He was in command of that team and defending that building for about 2 days. And then a lieutenant came in and actually led the defense for the next 58. So it was named for the guy who stormed it. Soviet propaganda and myth, and we'll talk about this a lot tonight, would lead people to believe that the building was defended by about 30 guys for 2 months, and that's definitely not what happened. So we'll dig into that as we talk about the research phase. So this was the design question, right? So at the beginning, when I started working on this game, as I said, the Soviet myth would have you believe that about 30 Soviet soldiers held a key strong point in Stalingrad for 60 days. And just a little, this is obviously not a discussion about the Battle of Stalingrad. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to frame the discussion just a little bit, we have Operation Blue. It was a German effort to essentially take the oil fields in Baku down in the Caucasus. Stalingrad was a part of that, and it became a focus point of Operation Blue. And here we have, just again to set the context about where Pavlov's house fits in the Battle of Stalingrad, you have a build out, a timeline of the battle leading up until the Soviets took the building. But what I really wanted to call your attention to is the sort of German forces as they collapse along the Volga there. So you can see the German forces starting on the left side and moving closer and closer over this, up until late September timeframe. And if you look on the far right map, you'll see where I have circled in blue. That's the 13th Guards, and that is the unit, the division that Pavlov's house was part of, and that's the area that Pavlov's house existed in. So as we go through the rest of this, it's, when you're thinking about the defense of this area, these guys were essentially in an island, right? They were surrounded completely by Germans. The only area they didn't have Germans around them was behind them, where they were butting up against the Volga. And this is just a zoomed in view of that area. So we have, again, one battalion there in the center. Those two red buildings, the rightmost is Pavlov's house. So that's the building we're really talking about, the one that was being defended. And as I said, after the initial 4-man team that went in and stormed the building and took it, after that, the infantry group that moved in was essentially a rifle platoon. So it was a rifle platoon subordinate to that battalion. Okay, so let's talk about the research phase of this. Now, I already mentioned this in passing, where we have this Soviet propaganda that would have you believe that Pavlov's house was defended by 24 guys led by Sergeant Pavlov, and they defended it for 2 months by themselves, totally by themselves. And during the research phase, I've got a few things listed here that are key to me in doing this sort of design where you're trying to dig into the history and make it come alive in the model in the game. One is the validity of sources. So we have a situation in the Eastern Front of World War II where you're fighting against two things. One, you're fighting against the Soviet propaganda, and two, you're fighting against this. What happened basically after the war is the Western world were largely dependent on German sources coming out of that. So we were relying on German sources. You had this weird, especially in the military, in the war game world, situation where we had all these German sources, and you had people who were oftentimes, you had this sort of glorification of German activity in World War II, which was strange. We've seen sort of a pushback against that, thankfully, in the last couple of decades, but that was an issue coming out of World War II. And then we had the Soviet myth. So we have to dig through all of that. We're fortunate that at the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an opportunity for people in the Western world to travel to Russia and dig into some of the primary source material for the first time and really dig into the true story of what happened in some of these cases. So like I said, validity of the sources, and oftentimes, we're dealing with multiple conflicting pieces of information, or equally problematic circular reporting where you see one thing and it's just repeated over and over and not challenged. And then the last bullet I have there, challenge popular views, which is exactly what this is all about, right? So challenging the view that this was just an infantry platoon that defended the building. Oh, let me reset this. Hold, stay with me for just a moment. Okay, so how do we push back against all of that, right? Push back against the intentional propaganda or the circular reporting or the adoption of sort of the German view without really looking at that in depth. So one method that I use that I like is one method of deconstructing a complex issue like this is a structured analytic technique called a mind map. One thing I do borrow from my day job as an intel analyst is my approach to complex problems like this and how you deconstruct them to build a model. And mind mapping is one technique for doing that. And the idea for a mind map is you just take the central concept, right? So like our design question here, how did these Soviet soldiers hold a strong point for 60 days? And we just blow it out. It's a bit sort of a structured brainstorming session. It's especially useful if you have multiple people, especially people who aren't intimately familiar with the issue, because they can ask you questions that sort of make you challenge some of the assumptions or think through this in a new way. For the purposes of tonight, I've just kind of thrown out a mind map that's a little bit more polished than what you would get in the real world. But when we look at this second case study, I'll give you a view of what it looked like when I actually did it legitimately the first time. So here it would be simple. We have one concept. We have the building, Pavlov's house, and we have a rifle platoon. That's who's defending it. That's what we're led to believe. Oh, this is interesting. I keep getting jumped back to the first slide. So let me try to avoid that. So as I started digging into this, one of the more recent English language documents included interviews with a forward observer. He was a forward observer from an artillery unit that was actually in the building. And that was the first indication I got, wait a second, there's a little bit more going on here than just this rifle platoon. This forward observer, and he wasn't alone, was in the house, and they were calling in lots of artillery support for the defenses. As they saw German troops marshaling to make attacks, they would call in artillery to help. And so, in some cases, the defenders weren't even actually active, right? If the artillery was doing its job well enough. And I started peeling the onion back a little bit more, and it wasn't just forward observers in the building. There was actually a mortar platoon and an entire mortar platoon that was stationed there. An anti-tank squad was there. A machine gun platoon was assigned to the building. So all of this stuff was based in the building, not even from the same company or same battalion. Some of these were regiment level assets that had been allocated to the building. So you can see you can already start to see, okay, the importance is clear here. And then one thing I should say is the reason why Pavlov's house was so important is a 4-story tall building, and it provided a fantastic view over that section of Stalingrad. So it's something that the Soviets wanted to hold. Obviously, they didn't want the Germans to take it. And then there were also snipers that moved in and out of the building throughout the course of the battle. But that wasn't all. So I already mentioned artillery, but if you look at the different nodes here that are moving out from the central Pavlov's house, you can see major other components that were contributing to the defense. So the artillery obviously tied to the forward observers. There were sappers that were sent in. They were doing a couple of different things. We have sketches from the defenders at the time that they made at the time. And one of the key things that the sketches depicted were both the anti-armor and anti-personnel defenses that the sappers placed around the building in all directions. And they obviously did repairs to the building. The building was being damaged throughout the battle. In fact, if you see some of the pictures that were taken of the building after the battle, almost the entire facade that faced the Germans had been destroyed. And there was a building, it was originally an apartment building, and it was a mirrored building. It was exactly the same construction that was, a few hundred meters away, that had been completely destroyed. It had been bombed during the early Stuka bombings. It had been completely annihilated. So you can see that this the constant repairs against the building were critical. We have logistics. So the entire time these guys were being resupplied with ammunition, medical supplies, food, etc. And those logistics oftentimes had to be shipped across the Volga. We'll look into that in more depth later. The communications were a huge part. They had to stay in communications, not just with their battalion, but also their regiment, their division, all the way up to the 62nd Army Command Post, which was the command post in charge of the battle in sort of the central and north part of Stalingrad. And then air defenses were critical, especially in the early days when the Germans effectively had air supremacy around Stalingrad. Okay, so that mind map. So this is just a general concept of what things looked like, just all the different bits of it. That was the mind map. The next step is to turn that deconstruction to sort of all the component parts, but without any sort of logical framework, into something like this. Now, it doesn't have to look like this, obviously, but this is my model. This is a pretty simplified model of the game, and it's not focusing on the skirmish level engagement part, but it's focusing on all those other components that are facilitating the defense of Pavlov's house. And so this isn't a direct flow chart, right? There's no single starting place. You can kind of begin anywhere. And the point here is to demonstrate all the interconnectivity between both the German attackers and all the other component parts on the Soviet side that made the defense possible. So if you look on the left side, you have all the warm colors. Those are all the Germans, right? So those are German artillery, armor, infantry, sniper, Stukas. Those are all the different elements that were trying to directly or indirectly attack, take, destroy Pavlov's house. You can see there's dashed lines with arrows coming out of each one of those. Anywhere where a dashed line and arrow leads to, that means that element was specifically trying to target, destroy, take that element of Pavlov's house, or that element that was contributing to the defense. I'm not going to dig into each one of these elements, but I'll just give you a couple of examples of how the flow works. So if you look at the top of the model, sort of top center, you'll see the 62nd Army Command Post. As I said, that's the main command post that's leading the defense pretty much of most of Stalingrad as when we think of the battle. So you see there's one arrow leading off to the left, and it's called Storm Group. So it wasn't enough for the defenders of Pavlov's house just to defend the building. In addition to that, they would oftentimes be called upon to conduct storm group assaults from that building. So they'd have to leave, they'd have to mount storm group assaults, try to take German buildings and hold them. So that command is coming from the Army Command Post. But if you go to look to the right, there's an arrow coming out called resupply. And so they're also the ones who are making the strategic decisions about, what are the important things that we need to keep resupplied, what areas we're going to continue to hold. And if you look at that, we have a lot of enablers that have to happen before we can get supplies to Pavlov's house. So they have to make a decision. Yes, we're going to allocate resources. You can see the type of stuff: medical supplies, food, ammunition, equipment for sappers. That decision happens. The resources are allocated. They have to be loaded onto elements of the Volga flotilla, so the assets that are responsible for moving the stuff across the Volga. It has to be shipped to Pavlov's house, and then from then it can be distributed. But you can see that during that process, the Volga flotilla, as well as crossing the Volga, was extremely vulnerable to Stuka attack. And so you can see where you have that point of interaction. And then, of course, you can see where the air defenses around Stalingrad were trying to provide ground-based air defense coverage for the flotilla. Okay, so let's move on now. I just want to, and if you think about it, very little, I don't think anything that I've talked about so far has really talked about game design mechanisms. And really, that's not the point, in my opinion, for tonight. I wanted to talk about the sort of model that contributed to it. We'll talk a little bit more about some game design specifics in the second case study, but I did think it was important just to show the board for Pavlov's house before we continue on and talk about some game design stuff. So this board is designed to show three things. On the far left, it's a view down into Pavlov's house, right? So as I said, it's a 4-story building. This is obviously an abstraction. It's just showing them fighting from the top floor because that's where they typically were, because that's the best line of sight and vantage point they had. As you move to the right in the center of the board, it has sort of the tactical level surrounding area of around Pavlov's house. So those colored arrows are the German avenues of approach towards Pavlov's house. So you can see, as I said before, they're completely surrounded. Germans were constantly attacking from every direction throughout the defense of the house. And then on the far right, we have an operational level view of the area around Pavlov's house along the Volga. And so that's where we have all the different operational elements that are contributing to the defense. One thing I will just quickly point out, we'll talk about this a lot more in the second case study, is the way that line of sight works in this system. So you can see in the far left, in those individual squares, we have them colored purple, red, green. That is a very, very sort of streamlined way to get at line of sight for this skirmish level type of engagement, where if a Soviet defender is sitting in a purple colored box in the house, that means they have line of sight to an avenue of approach for the Germans. So you'll be able to see how those colors match up. Okay, so now I want to dig into some of the game design decisions that were made based on the model that we constructed. So I've talked about a little bit of this already when I gave the example of the 62nd Army Command Post. Its primary role in the game is to order storm group assaults and to allocate resources. I've also listed the dependencies, again, just to tie back to the interconnectivity between different elements in each of these elements as we move through them. So the dependency for the command post is it has to have soldiers in Pavlov's house to conduct storm group assaults. And of course, air defenses are a dependency, and they will continue to be a dependency for all of these, again, primarily because of the constant Stuka attacks, especially early on in the battle. The 13th Guards Rifle Division, that was the division that the defenders were part of. It's a tactical command post. Their primary role in the game is to decide which resources or which reinforcements rather, need to be sent to the house. So in the beginning of the game, the only thing in the house, just like it was in reality, is the 4-man storm group team. So the player, just like in the real world, is going to have to say, well, what are our most important reinforcements to get to the house first? Do we need to establish machine gun teams, anti-tank teams? What are we most concerned about, and make those your priority? We talked about the flotilla a little bit already as far as their role. Their role was really that resupply itself, moving the stuff across the Volga. I did want to point out, I have a map here on the left side where, just to give you a sense of all the activity that was happening by the flotilla during the Battle of Stalingrad. The blue circled area was where they were making channel crossings, and those were the crossings that facilitated the resupply of the area around Pavlov's house. The 139th Signal Battalion, so this was a wire communications unit that its job in life was essentially to maintain all wire comms to all command posts and control posts throughout the battle. The depiction on the left-hand side, I created this map based on the last good high-quality documentation we had before the storm group assault happened, but it was about a week and a half to 2 weeks before. And so you don't actually see the wire comms connections that existed by the time that the Soviets had retaken Pavlov's house and established that connection. So that's why the actual wire diagram doesn't exist there. But in the game, having your wire comms linked out to the other command posts, the thing that it facilitates is essentially improved command and control, and that's modeled through effectiveness or efficiency in the game. And there's also in the game a fog of war mechanic that this pushes back against. The sappers, we talked about this already. They were there to do two things: to establish sort of a last line of defense against both anti-personnel and anti-armor, but also to buttress the building, to repair the building to damage that had been done. And their dependencies are, again, the command post, allocating them the resources needed to conduct the sapper missions, and the flotilla for moving those supplies. The artillery units, they have, this is an interesting element in the game, because if you think about the way artillery works, you need that forward observer, right? So you have to dedicate the resources to get forward observers into the house. And then you also have to dedicate resources to the artillery itself for conducting fire missions. And so there's a sort of a two-pronged thing there. It creates extra dependencies and extra vulnerabilities, but the effect can be very powerful. On the left-hand side, we just have a map of all the different artillery units that were supporting the Battle of Stalingrad. We know for a fact that the 32nd Guards did. It's also possible that the 384th did, based on their proximity to where the house's location was. And the anti-aircraft units, I've talked a lot about all the different components being very dependent on air defenses, and that's what we have depicted here. Now, this map is very outdated by the time, so keep in mind, Pavlov's house was taken on September 25th. This is way back in August 23rd. So all of those air defenses on the left-hand side of the Volga, almost all of those had been taken out by this time, especially on the southern part of the city. Just one interesting piece of information. At the point that this occurred, about 60 to 70% of personnel manning or crewing the Soviet air defense units were women. And that if you look at the top of the map, the 1077th, that air defense unit, that was actually a unit that had to engage German Panzer Division with their anti-aircraft guns. So that you'll often hear when you talk about the Battle of Stalingrad, some of the German units talking about the women operators of the anti-aircraft guns and how dedicated they were, and that was that unit. So I just wanted to draw that to people's attention. But I've got circled the units there that most likely provided air defense coverage, and that's for two reasons. One, their location, their proximity to Pavlov's house, and two, because they're on the right-hand side of the Volga and probably continued to live, at least in to some degree, throughout the entire defense. And then so we have the actual defenders inside. So, you know, we go all the way back to this myth of 24 or 30 rifle, a rifle platoon defending the house. And what we actually see as we go through this, all the different component parts that had to contribute to it. But on the diagram on the left, in the bottom, I've got shaded this sort of pink color. Those are the actual elements, and this sort of line diagram going back up to all the way up to the 62nd Army. Those are the actual elements sitting inside Pavlov's house, to give you a sense of how that worked. And so I wanted to finish this case study talking about, full circle back to skirmish level engagements, because we really talked about all the things that facilitated it. So line of sight already touched on. Effective weapon range is interesting. In this game, effective weapon range is not a significant part of the design, because of the position of Pavlov's house, because as the Germans entered into the 9 January square, which is the area around Pavlov's house, they were within effective weapon range of everything the Soviets had. One of the critical elements was that they were able to get much higher than very high above the attacking German tanks and target them with anti-tank rifles and anti-tank guns that were very effective because they're hitting the tops of the tanks. Command and control in the game is, we already talked about maintaining wire communications to your command posts, but it's also important at the skirmish level. Sergeant Pavlov plays an important part of the leadership team, as does the lieutenant and the captain, who ultimately can take control of the defense of the building. And again, that's modeled through improved efficiencies in the game. And then a couple of specific capabilities I did want to just touch on briefly here before we move on was suppression, the importance of suppression. That's a huge element in the model, in the gameplay, and in the actual defense. The Soviets were extremely well postured with the heavy machine guns, the medium machine guns, mortar teams. So they were able to lay out massive amounts of suppression against the German infantry that wanted desperately to cross 9 January Square to get at the building, but weren't able to. And then I already talked about the importance of the anti-tank weapons. So the conclusion for this one is that, the defense of Pavlov's house really for 60 days was only possible through significant strategic and operational level investment. And of course, as we talked about quite a bit, the excellent operational and tactical level coordination, rather than the heroic feats of just a few infantrymen against all odds. So I think we're going to stop here, and Sebastian, check in with you to see if there were any questions up until this point.
Yeah, David, we have a couple questions. The first one asks, when developing the game or any historical game, do you visit the site in person if possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I have, sometimes I haven't. I have not gone to Volgograd or, previously Stalingrad. I have not been there. I've done a lot of work in, so like the Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms game, which is part of the same series of games. I traveled to Danzig to do the research. When I was working on a game, Undaunted Normandy, I traveled to all the different battlefields for that one. So whenever possible, that's certainly my preference, to be able to go and see. It's especially true for these static, small scale engagements. Seeing the actual terrain, seeing the battlefield really helps. And it did help when I traveled to Danzig to see the defense of the post office there. Being able to see it for myself definitely informed the design.
So the next question asks, what are some of the differences when designing a squad level war game versus, let's say, a regiment, a division, or any other sort of larger scale operational game?
Yeah, so for me, one of the reasons that I like, probably the main reason I like to design at the skirmish or tactical level, is because I'm much more interested in the personal story of the engagement. And what I mean by that is, despite the 30 minutes, I just spent going through this model, I'm not actually interested in modeling a realistic battle. What I'm interested in modeling is evoking a very specific feeling I want the game player to take away the game, from the gameplay experience. So Pavlov's house, the point is I want the player to understand that interconnectivity between the two different elements, right? The operational and tactical elements. And in Lanzerath Ridge, we'll talk about later, it's the desperation and the lack of ammunition and all sorts of other things. So there's a goal in mind with the design that's not necessarily just to do a modeling for realism kind of effort. The further I get away from that, like as the scale increases, I feel like I'm less interested in that sort of design, because I'm less capable of telling a sort of almost emotional response that I'm trying to elicit with the game design versus just the objective model, if you will, of the conflict. So that's not exactly the answer, because I think there was, talking about the differences. The truth answer is I haven't done a lot of design work at other scales, with the exception of stuff that are like more geopolitical. So I've done a game called Europe Divided, but that is a very strategic geopolitical type game rather than a war game, a military game.
On that note, David, when you can come over to my house and we're going to play Divided Europe, huh?
Yeah, I'll be there. I'll be there soon.
Yeah. So the next question is, what is one of your favorite game designs that you've designed? And what other games have influenced your design? So I know that's sort of a general question, but I know that's something I'm sure a lot of people are interested in.
Sure. So I am super fortunate. I'm the luckiest guy in the world because I have, of my 3 kids, 2 of them love playing games with me. So I'm biased in my response to the first question, because it's whatever game that I've designed most recently, because they always love playing it with me. So for literally 2 years, I think their favorite game was probably a game I designed called the War Chest. They played it. We played it almost every day. More recently, I had a game come out called Sniper Elite that I've been playing constantly with my kids, and so they genuinely like playing it, which makes me the happiest guy on planet Earth. So it's not that I like one of my games more than another because of the game itself. It's whatever game my kids want to play with me is going to be my favorite game at the time. So that'll probably always be the newest thing that has come out, because they ship to the new hotness. But And then as far as games that influenced me, I've often said that the most influential game to me was A Few Acres of Snow. It's a game designed by Martin Wallace about the French and Indian War. I got into playing games and designing games around 2012 or so, and it had come out around that time, maybe a little earlier than that. And it introduced me to the concept of deck building. It introduced me to this concept of sort of hybrid war games and Euro games. So a lot of the things that are still core design tenets and things that I value came from my initial plays of that game, and it's still one of my favorite games today.
That's great. How do you make decisions on which node relationships directly simulate or abstract, or particularly in the discussing of roles of enabling assets come from off the board or on the board?
Yeah, so all of the stuff, so it depends on the game, right? So when I'm doing a game like this, Pavlov's House is the only game in this line of, it's called the Valiant Defense series. And so the things that the games that have come out so far are a game called Castle Itter, a game called Soldiers in Postmen's Uniforms, the game we're about to talk about next called Lanzerath Ridge, and then Pavlov's House. Pavlov's House is the only one that is a sustained defense over a long period of time that required this modeling and abstraction of outside the skirmish level. And so it's the only one I've had the opportunity to do that with. So from that perspective, everything off the board is everything that's outside of the skirmish level, one person is one counter model. And all of those are heavily abstracted, right? So definitely, I am never trying to achieve some high level of realism. I'm just trying to convey the interconnectivity and the enabling relationship between the two things. And you can do that very simply through a very, sort of streamlined, hopefully elegant abstraction, or you can try to dig deep and make it super realistic. But honestly, I would rather design a game that plays in 75 minutes and you learn that lesson through an abstraction than like a 6-hour game that gets you there through, hyper efforts at realism.
So the last question before we press on is, when do you find it's more natural or critical to decide the abstractions, during the deconstruction or when modeling the mechanics and interactions of those mechanics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's not one time. I think that can happen to either. The deconstruction, during the deconstruction phase, if I'm being a good steward of the process, I'm not thinking about game design at that point. All I'm doing at that point is thinking, these are the component parts that have to appear in the game to some extent, right? This is the thing that is a key part of the quote unquote story of the battle that must exist in the game. And so I'll flag it and say it has to be in it. I'll come back to later how exactly that's going to happen. And I guess the more critical it is to the totality of the rest of the game, the more, it's not realistic, it's not the right word for it, but the more potentially complex I'll allow it to be, right? So there's this balance of complexity versus elegance or streamlining, and something has to be very, very, very important to allow it to sort of creep beyond that most basic level of elegance in the design.
As always, great answers, David. So I'm gonna hold the rest of the questions and you can press on and we'll get back to the next questions in the next Q&A section.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so let's transition now to Lanzaroth Ridge. So, the title of this presentation was Skirmish-Level Engagement, and that's what we're going into big time. So this is very unlike the other. This is essentially it's an intelligence reconnaissance platoon, understrength platoon at the time. They were joined by 4 forward observers, and they were holding out on this ridge you can see here in the picture, just to give you a sense. We are looking from the perspective of the German attackers as they're looking up the ridge at the tree line where the American defenders were positioned. This battle happened in the very first hours of the Battle of the Bulge. And so we'll talk about how an intel and reconnaissance platoon was able to hold out against a battalion of German paratroopers, probably should say that in quotes, for basically an entire day. So again, I'll leave with a quote. Let everyone take just a moment to read that. This is mostly true, though I will say that propaganda and hyperbole and exaggeration is not limited just to Soviets. This intelligence reconnaissance platoon, they did do amazing work. They did not single-handedly delay by 20 hours the advance of the entire 1st SS Panzer Division. I won't talk about all the other things that contributed to that, but there were a lot of things that conspired against the Germans for the 1st SS Panzer Division to be delayed by 20 hours. However, the defense of Lanzerath Ridge was a critical part of that. So here, the design question, how did they do that? How did the INR platoon delay the advance of the Panzer Division on the first day of the Battle of the Bulge? And so again, this is not a briefing or a presentation on the Battle of the Bulge, so I'll move quickly through this. I just wanted to give everyone just a sense of where we are in the story. Moving from left to right, we sort of have a zoomed in view of where we are. So we are specifically in organizationally the 5th Corps of the US, well, the Allied sort of pocket around where the Battle of the Bulge formed, right? And as we move in, we zoom in a little bit further, we're specifically looking at a 99th Infantry Division. Now, on the map on the left, you can see 2 of the regiments, the 393rd and the 394th. You can see where that sort of regimental line is broken up by that dashed line. But at the bottom, where I've got the blue circle, where I've outlined the village of Lanzerath, this is what I really want to talk about for just a moment. So that dashed line, you can see the division between 5th Corps and 8th Corps. And so the important thing here is the intelligence or reconnaissance platoon with the intelligence reconnaissance unit subordinate to the 394th Infantry Regiment. So if you look just above that core line, you're going to see the 394th. So what this means is this platoon that we're looking at, they were actually positioned intentionally beyond their regiment boundary. They were deployed outside of their divisional boundary. They were deployed outside of their corps boundary. So they're actually, like, from a command and control perspective and how you want to deploy your force and stuff, this is extremely non-doctrinal. They're also deploying an INR platoon to do a conventional force mission, right? An INR platoon is not designed to go fill a gap and hold a position, but that's exactly what they were asked to do. They were sent to this position on December 10th, December 11th, that time frame. They were told to relieve a conventional force unit and essentially defend this position. The intent was that they were just going to be there for a short period of time and they themselves would be relieved. Now, you can also see that in that same circle, there's a unit labeled the 820th Tank Destroyer. It was a unit that was part of 8th Corps. So you have 2 different units from 2 different corps sitting inside of the village at the same time on the morning of the Battle of the Bulge. To their credit, these 2 units did cooperate. They talked to one another. They both knew that they were there. The Tank Destroyer unit was actually positioned in the town. The INR platoon that we're talking about in this case study was sort of on the north edge of the town on the top of the ridge overlooking it. But as I said, they did communicate. And there were forward observers from a couple of different artillery units that were also positioned in the town. So these are a couple of aerial views. They were taken within a month or 2 of the battle. So they give a really accurate depiction of what the battlefield looked like. 2 different views, though sort of similarly oriented. You kind of look at either of these as I walk through this. But the main points, there's a lot of information here. Most of it's not germane to the discussion tonight. The main thing you need to know is, as we talk about the defense of the ridge, that's the blue shaded area. So the labeled 1, that's where the US defenders are positioned throughout the entire battle. They were looking down across the ridge to the road that went through the town. Sort of this is positioned where it's sort of west is up, and as you look at the image, so the Germans were coming through the town from east to west. And if you look at that ridge, you can see there's a crossroads there. So this was a critical crossroads. If the Germans get through this, it would allow them to basically get behind the infantry regiment that the INR platoon is part of. So defending this crossroads was pivotal. Okay, so the research, I've already talked about the research process. I won't go into this. I would just say that whereas previously with the Pavlov's house example, I was primarily fighting against the Soviet propaganda and the circular Western reporting of German accounts. The challenge here is when you're really digging in deeply to these skirmish level engagements, every little bit, every piece of information is super important. And there's a lot of secondary sources, and then there's some primary sources that are pretty good, but oftentimes they are potentially, there's some potential memory problems, right? So there's lots of interviews, not lots, there's a handful of interviews with participants in the battle, but they were done many, many, many years later. And one of the reasons for that is this battle didn't really gain prominence until the 1980s, when the unit was, there was a congressional hearing to award them medals for their actions. And so because of those congressional hearings, we get lots of great interviews and we have lots of great written accounts, but lots of time has passed and different accounts, there are varied different accounts. And so you can kind of hand wave it and say, well, you know, I don't care, this is an abstraction, it doesn't matter. But when some of the things you want to convey in this design are what's the importance of machine gun fire, how, you know, what's the line of sight of an individual machine gun, because that is hugely important in this battle. Knowing exactly where it is and what its field of fire, those are very important things. And so you have to be able to align lots of different, in this case, conflicting reports. Okay, so I wanted to talk now about the importance of geospatial analysis. We've already talked about the sort of topography. I mentioned visiting Gdansk or previously Danzig for the soldiers and postmen's uniforms, or going to Normandy and visiting the battlefields there to look at the topography. That's an extremely important part of this game, right? So we have to understand, if we're going to say this is how the American defenders were able to defend this ridge, well, what was it about this ridge that allowed them to be so successful? And so the source material that I used in conjunction with Niels Johansson, who is the graphic designer, the artist, and also, like as I said before, a GIS specialist, we had a lot of good source material. I already showed you the two aerial views we had right after the battle. That was fantastic. In the upper right, we have a sketch that was done in 1981. So again, it's dated, but it is by one of the members of the platoon, right? So we have that, you know, that sketch. And of course, although it is a sketch, if you look at it, it closely aligns, you know, generally speaking, to the topography. So it makes a lot of sense. We also benefit, of course, from the fact that we have modern day access to modern day geospatial data. And that image in the bottom center there was actually a satellite image from last year. And so if you compare the aerial view from the 1944, 1945 to an image now, the battlefield basically has not changed at all. So that's hugely beneficial as we're modeling this battle now. We don't have that luxury for Pavlov's house. You know, if you look at Volgograd, the entire thing is very different. But here in Lanzaroth, nothing has changed really. There's literally like a handful of new houses and that's it. And then of course we have the topographical GIS data layers that we can use to inform things like measuring distance or measuring elevation and precise elevation. So all of that contributes to being able to create an accurate battlefield. And so this is the resulting board for the game. It's essentially a one-to-one modeling of the environment, taking from those maps and taking from the geospatial data. And so what you see on this map, I'll just try to walk you through it to orient you to it. The squares that are sort of in the center of the map, those are the defensive fighting positions occupied by the Americans. So they had extremely good cover and concealment during this battle. So what happened is, I told you they arrived on December 10th. They got there, the dugouts they inherited were actually pretty good quality, but they improved them. They dug them deeper, but more importantly, probably, is they covered them with logs. And going into this battle, it had snowed quite a bit. And so essentially you had dugout positions completely covered by logs that were completely snow covered. So you have these Americans who are almost impossible to see. And even if you could see them, the amount of cover they had was incredible. So you have these positions, and of course they're right on the tree line. So you have them, you have to deal with the concealment of the trees afforded also. So you have these amazing defensive positions at the top of the ridge the Americans were in. Well, the circles are the paths, the avenues of approach to the German quote unquote paratroopers. We'll talk about that later on. But the paratroopers took. And so if you look at the center of the board, those central sort of 3 different paths are the primary routes that the Germans took over and over and over throughout this battle, charging straight up the hill, trying to attack the Americans. They had no cover, they had no concealment. They were trying to climb over a fence about halfway through the ridge. So that's where we are with this battle. Okay, so I told you earlier when I showed you the mind map of Pavlov's house, it was very pretty looking. Well, obviously I don't do mind maps like that. When I'm really doing the mind map for a game, it's sketches and I'm erasing stuff and it's multiple iterations and multiple pages. I wanted to show you what an example of that would have looked like one iteration of that would have looked like for a game, as just to compare and contrast. And so I found this in one of the early sketches from the research phase of working on Lanzerath Ridge. So this is just obviously no human on planet Earth can make sense of my chicken scratch, but this is the mind map that I was working through as I was designing the early or doing the deconstruction of the game. But I will show you, this is a resulting model. And I wanted to compare this to the Pavlov's house model because here we actually, in Pavlov's house, I didn't even show the tactical part, right? That whole part is like another sort of sub model of what I showed you. But here we actually get to see the skirmish level engagement piece of it. So there's a couple of things. At first, I've laid this out, not, in the Pavlov's house, it was just an abstraction. You had all the sort of German stuff on the left-hand side, and it was just flowing to the right. And again, it was just trying to show you interconnectedness. But here, if you think about sort of the attackers coming across the open field, I've actually laid the model out spatially because that spatial adjacency is such a critical part of the game. And so what you see is the different lines of German infantry starting on the left-hand side and going towards the right. And then you see, those are all the squares. And then you see the sort of rounded, all the rectangles. So then you see sort of the rounded rectangle positions, the forward position, the right flank, left flank. Those are the American occupied positions in this model. And so I just wanted to talk briefly. We'll talk about some of this in more depth later, but this model shows the spatial sort of connection between the Germans and the Americans, but also the dotted lines show the spatial connection between the different various American positions, because whereas the concept of time in Pavlov's house is super abstract. You're playing through 60 days, and that, what does that exactly mean? What's around? There's not really a sense of a round of Pavlov's house equaling a very specific set of time. That's not true for Lanzerath Ridge. So the game is divided into 4 decks of enemy attack cards, 4 waves. Each of those waves in the real world took about a minute. And so in the game, there's no time to move from the left flank to the right flank. Like that, if you're doing that, that's all you're doing during an entire engagement. And so the spatial connectiveness of each of these positions, that's the reason that I've got them in the model, because they're super important to the actual gameplay itself. I've also labeled some of the elements like the machine guns I told you about that were critical to this. So the Americans had, going into this battle, they had an M2 that was mounted on their Jeep, so a 50 cal. They had a 30 caliber machine gun, and they had 2 BARs. One of them was originally positioned on the left flank, and I won't delve into the side story now, but they actually lost 3 members of defense and the BAR prior to the battle because they sent them off to try to find some missing members of the platoon. So they actually lost that asset that would have been helpful in the defense. The other thing that's baked into this model that might not be immediately transparent is line of sight. So I've color coded everything according to whether or not it has line of sight. So for example, if you take a look at the top left for the German infantry, that orange rectangle, you can see that it directly connects to the right flank of the American position and that they have line of sight to one another. And then if you move down for the German and the infantry that's in the middle, it has line of sight to both the Americans' forward central positions as well as the M2G. So it just allows this model to convey tons of different information about both the actual conflict, but also the game design itself. There is points of connectivity here. You can see in the same exact way that it happens in Pavlov's house. You can see here, the Germans have mortars. It's black because nobody has line of sight to them. They're sort of quote unquote off board. But the Americans have the ability to call in artillery, which is also off board. So even though those are both off board, they can also directly interact with each other. Okay, so we'll move on from the model. We'll talk about a few things here. We're going to concentrate for a while primarily on the forward positions for the Americans. And the reason for that is that's where most of the battle was taking place. I told you that there were 4 waves of German attacks. Those occurred, the first one was 10 in the morning. The last one was 4 at night. And I say night intentionally because sunset on this day was like 4:15 or something. So the last attack occurred as the sun was setting. So the Germans had the benefit of attacking under the cover of darkness. All 4 of those attacks included waves of Germans coming up the central, basically charging up the center towards the Americans. Only the last attack had a heavy use of attacking the American flank positions. And the second attack had a little bit of a probing on the flanks. That was it. So I mentioned this before, but the defenders have excellent cover and concealment. They also have 7 dugout positions that, and we'll see this a little bit more in detail in just a moment. So they have 7 positions that have line of sight to every single German coming up the ridge. So the Germans have to cross about 160, 170 meters of open field. They have to navigate a fence. They have to avoid booby traps. So what the Americans did smartly in the days leading up to this is they took their hand grenades and they turned them into essentially wired booby traps. Okay, so the line of sight and fields of fire for the American defenders in the center. As I said, there were 7 defensive positions that had overlapping fields of fire towards all the Germans coming up the ridge. Almost everybody was equipped with an M1 rifle. The officers had carbines. The Germans had no cover, they had no concealment as they were coming up the ridge. So as I told you in Pavlov's house, it didn't make a ton of sense to try to model effective weapon range or really efficacy to a great detail, right? It's a relatively abstracted element in that. You either have a rifle that can hit a German infantryman, or you have an anti-tank weapon that can hit a tank or whatever. But it was important in this game to model efficacy because basically to tell the story of the importance of the machine guns. I mean, ultimately is what it came down to. And so the way I approach this is by using target numbers to hit for the defenders based on how far away they are from the attacker, targets to hit the attackers based on how far away they are from the defenders, and assigning dice types to the weapon types the Americans were wielding, right? So you can kind of think of the M1 rifle as our baseline in this model, right? And so you're rolling a single D8 with, if a defender is equipped with an M1, they're rolling a single D8, and the target number is that little white number in the brown square attached to the attacker's position. And so I've just got the probability of hitting each of those targets based on how far away, right? So you can see the likelihood of hitting with an M1 drops off pretty far, pretty quickly based on how far away they are. I should say that this is probably self-evident, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. The vast majority of the kills of the Germans, or the casualties of the Germans, happened right at the fence line. And that's basically what the Germans would do, is they would run up to the fence line, and they were either scared, understandably, to try to climb over the fence, and they would sort of stop there or until they were ordered to continue on, or they would try to climb the fence, in which case they exposed themselves and oftentimes they became a target and a casualty. Oh man, that's not good. I don't know what's going on there. Sorry. We'll get back there quickly. So, almost there. Okay, so that was weapon efficacy against range. One thing I wanted to talk about though was, how do you model in an elegant way? Again, my ultimate goal is, I don't want to beat the player over the head with a bunch of rules to try to achieve something. I want to have a simple rule that a player doesn't need to know that an M1 rifle has better efficacy than a carbine at long range, right? Like that should come out in the gameplay. The player shouldn't have to know that and instinctively to understand the game. And so similarly, how do I model these different avenues of approach that the Germans were taking with a single target number to hit, but allow the defenders to shoot across these different areas of the ridge line? And so what I've done is you can see there's a little sort of dashed line that has a +1 that this red arrow is going across. And that's just saying, if you, as the defender shoots across that line, you're just going to add a +1 to the target's to hit number, right? So in this case, the defender has a 50% chance of hitting the target that's at range 5 in their sort of avenue of approach that's coming directly at them, or a 38% chance to hit the same, a target in the same number of 5, because you're just adding 1, 2. So very simple, but it achieves the desired effect, right? You just add a +1, but you can model the increased range by doing that. The other thing that we can do with this simple model is the MG42. So it's actually closer than some of those other targets, but it has a harder to hit number. And the reason for that is because, unlike all of the infantrymen that were just running up the ridge, the MG42s actually did have some dug-in positions that they were using for some cover, right? So that's why they enjoy like a higher level of defense there. So let's compare the way we did the M1 rifle with a single D8 representing its range and its effectiveness at range to the carbine. So the carbine gets 2d6 to roll. Now you're not summing the total of the 2d6, you're taking the highest individual roll amongst the 2 dice. And what that allows us to do is elegantly say, at point blank range, I should be able to probably hit a target with a semi-automatic, M1, a carbine. I'm probably going to hit the target more often than I'm going to hit him with a single, with an M1 rifle. However, that should shift at some point at range, and there's a point where literally the M1 carbine can't reach the target, right? Like it drops off pretty significantly at about 150 yards. And so we're able to do that again elegantly in the game by just saying, well, if you roll 2d6 and you take the highest, it means you're going to have a lot better chance to hit the closer targets. That drops off quickly and it maxes you out at your range you can shoot. And so that's what we're able to achieve there. Okay, so now let's shift our focus to how we work on the machine guns. So we'll look at the M2 as an example. The M1919 and the BAR do similar things with different dice. It doesn't really matter. They accomplish the same thing ultimately. So we assign it a D12. That means it has an increased maximum range. It has an increased probability to hit at closer range, but most importantly, it allows us to model this idea of concentrated fire. So the player has limited ammunition in this game, which was realistic. They ran out of ammunition, especially for their machine guns during the battle. And so it was very important for me to require the players to manage ammunition as a resource, right? We have to recreate that tension of having something that's very powerful, your machine guns, managing the resource to enables that through your ammunition. But the player has the option, they can spend ammunition. For every ammunition token that they spend, they can roll multiple dice at an individual target. And so if the target's closing in and it's very important, you really want to kill it, or if it's a leader and you want to kill it for specific reasons or whatever, you can choose to roll as many dice as you want. obviously the probability is going to scale rapidly for success. And so the numbers I've got here is the probability of just rolling a single die versus 3 dice, for example. Depending on the weapon, that drives how many dice you can choose to roll, how up to how many you can choose to roll. And so the M2, you can roll up to 6 if you wanted to, if you just wanted to burn through it. Now, the game also models overheating of the machine guns, and the reason for that is because they actually overheated one of their machine guns. And so what that means is if you ever choose to roll more than 3 dice, for every die you roll beyond that, you have to make a simple check, and if you fail it, then you've essentially damaged your machine gun. The other thing that they made extensive use of was traversing fire. And so the way that the game models this is same thing. You can roll multiple dice if you want to. Each of those dice don't have to be against the same target. However, for every target you shoot at past the first, they take a cumulative +1 to their target roll. So in this example, the target I've labeled as 1 would be the first target you're shooting at. There's no penalty against that one. Number 2, it's the same distance away, but you're increasing their defense, so you're lowering your probability to hit. And then target 3 the same. You can traverse, across. You can traverse in depth, whatever. There's no limit. You could concentrate fire, etc. So you have all of those sorts of options available to you, which the defenders employ during the battle. I did just include as an example here, as a reminder for me to talk about the position of the M2. So again, the 50 cal was on a Jeep. The Jeep was set back in the woods. That was good for it was well defended, but it did limit its line of sight. So in this case, the Jeep can't actually see the target to the far left. And you can see that the line of sight is indicated by the Jeep being in a purple position and the attackers having both brown and purple targets, right? So if you're in that position with the Jeep, you're rolling against the target, the 5 target, because of the distance away. And this is just a comparison of everything I just talked about, weapon efficacy, and the concentrated fire examples that I provided for the M19, 19, and M2 are just, if you chose to roll 3 dice, this is what it would be like. And this gives you a really quick way to glance across and say, okay, does it make sense that, firing concentrated fire with an M2 at point blank range is 99% likelihood? Does that make sense? Okay, so we talked about all of that was talking about the amazing amount of firepower the Americans could put on the Germans that were charging straight up the hill with no cover and concealment. But let's talk about the flank attacks, which you would have thought would have been what the Germans did to begin with. They didn't, and the reason for that is because I've said paratroopers in quotes a few times. This was really a remnants unit, or sort of a cobbled together unit of young boys, older men. They were assigned to a paratrooper unit. There were a few veterans, but very few. And so ultimately, by at nightfall, there was a sergeant amongst the Germans who essentially convinced the officers, we should be attacking at night. We should be attacking the flanks. What are we doing? This is insanity. And they finally did that. And so when these flank attacks happen at night, it's just as the Americans had lost contact. The radios had been hit by mortar fire or small arms fire. And so they had lost connectivity with the infantry regiment. And they were essentially down to the lieutenant, the platoon commander, saying, okay, we have to withdraw. We don't know what our orders are anymore. We've held this up. We fought for 6 hours straight. It's nighttime. We can't defend these positions anymore. We've run out of ammunition. We're going to withdraw. So right as he's making the order to withdraw is when the Germans made their final attack, primarily along the flanks. Because they were attacking the flanks, they now had mostly concealment, some cover. They didn't have to navigate the fence. They still did have to avoid booby traps. There were still some booby traps along the flanks. But again, they were massively benefited by this. And there were very few American positions that had line of sight to these positions, right? So On the left flank, the Americans could target them from 2 positions, and on the right flank, they could have targeted them from 2 positions, and that's it. Oh my goodness. Let's see if I can go all the way down here quickly. And I apologize again for that. We're almost at the end.
I forgive you, David.
Thank you. So that, yes, the conclusions, I could have probably just guessed. Okay, so the conclusion for this is, we started saying, hey, this American INR platoon stopped the Panzer division for 20 hours. They did a fight. They did hold off an entire battalion, numbers up to 500 people, certainly multiple companies as part of the offensive against them. They held them off for about 6 hours of combat. The Germans, because of the efforts, the Germans were still confused even going into the night about how many people were in the woods. They thought that there were more Americans than there were even after they captured the platoon. And so really the defense was made possible by a sort of a combination of things. One, the Americans were extremely well prepared. They had a ton of tactical expertise. The INR platoons were drawn from some really well qualified, they had expert marksmen. These guys had seen, even though the 99th had not been there for a ton of time, this unit, these guys had developed a ton of expertise. And then, as I just talked about, there was poor leadership amongst the Germans and just tactical inexperience by almost all of the attackers. So that combination of things is what led to the successful defense. And so that's the end of the second case study. So I think we can take any other questions.
So I'm gonna give people a few minutes as they put in additional questions, but I do have some left over from the previous one,
Sure.
which is, could you please provide more details about your research process? What are your sources? How do you cover it all by yourself? Do you have other people help you? Do you have a method?
Yeah, that's great questions. There's not one, I will say there's not one process. Each game has taken sort of its own path to research. My preference whenever possible is to collaborate with experts. So a couple of my games I mentioned before, Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms, that idea actually came from someone reaching out to me and proposing it as a topic after I'd finished Pavlov's House in Castle Itter. So I traveled to Gdansk to meet Michael Kochman is his name. He's credited as a co-creator for the game because he led the historic research for that. And so that was a different process where he really did lead the research, and then basically based on his research, I mean, I did some of it, right? But he led he did the majority of it. I did the deconstruction based on his research. A similar partnership I had with a gentleman by the name of Nicola Sigigini on a game called By Stealth and Sea. He led the vast majority of the historical research. And I did some stuff, very specific things, but he did the majority of it. If it's just me, then typically I do what everybody would do, right? I go and I look. Obviously, if given the choice, I'm going to go to primary sources, after action reports, getting as close to the battle as possible by the people that participated in the battle. Sometimes you can get really good reports. I did have some actual communications that were taken by, they were communications sent by the INR platoon, for example, in here to their regiment command post. And so some of those transcripts of those messages exist. And so I have some of that like directly firsthand at the time knowledge. If I don't have access to that, any artifacts that were left behind by the actual people that participated are, definitely the next best thing. So like I said, for this one, I had video interviews with some of the defenders. The documentation that existed for the congressional hearing was priceless because a lot of that came directly from the defenders. For Pavlov's House, it can be, and some of these, if it's a lesser known thing that was not a Western allied participant, then there could be a foreign language problem. So I had some Soviet documents that were in Russian that obviously I had the challenge of translating or getting translated. Same for Polish. But anyway, it was a really long way of saying definitely prefer firsthand accounts at the time. then primary sources by the participants if possible. And then after that, it's just looking at whatever books exist or whatever on the topic.
So the next question asks, how do you balance a smooth gameplay with historical accuracy? How much accuracy are you willing to sacrifice in any particular game to make it more fun or engaging?
Yeah, it goes back, like accuracy is an interesting word. So it goes back to when I talked about identifying the key elements that I wanted to convey to the game player, the key elements of the battle I want to evoke in the gameplay. So those things, I will do whatever's necessary to make sure that they exist in the game, but I will try to do so as elegantly as possible. So for example, let's take Lanzerath Ridge, right? So there were a few things that happened during the battle that absolutely had to exist in the game because I thought that they were so critical to the story of the battle. So I'll just give you some examples. One was after the second attack wave, the Germans wanted to recover their wounded on the bridge. And so they asked the Americans if they could, and the Americans allowed them to. And so you had German medics who would go up and they would recover, they would help the wounded. During that period, one of the American defenders saw and the Americans had been hit by mortars multiple times throughout the battle. One of the Americans saw one of the medics. The medics had a firearm on him, but he was also, it looked like he was trying to secretly talk into a radio. So the American identified him as a forward observer and attacked the medic. Now that story is told repeatedly. It's told all the time in every account, even by the people who did it, the videos. So I felt like that was part of the sort of lore of the thing, and it needed to exist. The Americans, as they were preparing to withdraw, they wanted to sabotage your own equipment, because if you're in conflict, then you have to abandon your equipment. You should sabotage your equipment, right? So they destroyed their machine guns, they destroyed their vehicles. So the game has an opportunity for you to do that. And then the last bit was, I told you the communications were cut off from the regiment command post, and the platoon leader sent back a couple of guys on foot to try to get new orders. And so all of those things, as I was researching it, all of those things felt like they needed to happen to tell the story the right way. But all of those things existed outside the core game design systems. And so I designed a subsystem that they all sort of elegantly, neatly fit into to solve that problem. So I guess the answer is I try to identify this, the game can't exist without this thing. Okay, we're going to have it. Now, how do I get it to either fit into an existing system or create like a single subsystem if necessary to account for that?
The next question asks, how do you plan and process the mechanisms and synergies during playtesting?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, sometimes you can build off of something you already know, right? So something that anybody that's ever played any of my games, I tend to do things like chit pull systems or bag building or deck manipulation. Like I know that those types of mechanisms allow me to do, like if I say I needed a command and control mechanism, then I know, oh, I can rely on that through deck building by doing XYZ. So you kind of build like your toolbox of, okay, I need to achieve this effect. What can I do? Like the weapon range example, since I talked about that in depth, right? Like that dice can achieve probabilities that you need and have limitations, and you can have these escalating dice types and stuff. And so once you've done that once or twice, when you get to a design problem, you're like, okay, let me go to my tool belt. Do I have a solution for this? Sometimes you're designing within constraints that force you to make certain decisions. Right now, I'm working on a game design where I've given myself physical component constraints, and so it introduces new challenges about how you solve it. So there's definitely, I know this isn't a great answer. There's no single process or technique that I use. It depends on the situation I'm in, but I would say the one thing that I try to draw from the experiences I've had before, right? I have the luxury of having worked on a lot of different things. And so rather than recreate the wheel, it's probably better to just kind of iterate off of what you know works successfully.
So the next question asks, the Valiant Defense series has emerged as one of the most loved solitaire war game series, reading verbatim, for both experienced and inexperienced gamers. What, in your opinion, makes the series so successful or so attractive?
Well, I hope that the games deliver on my effort to convey certain things to the player. Every game I'm trying to do a specific thing, right? Like it's like, this is the thing I'm trying to achieve primarily. And, the game the player should leave knowing that, right? So if you play Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms, it's about defending a post office against Danzig City Police and German SS and German SA, and you're just holding on, trying to last as long as you possibly can. But there's this interesting, the game is, hey, hold as long as you can, do these things, get victory points, win the game. But anyone who's played that game, the vast majority of the defenders are either paramilitary trained postal workers or just postal workers. They are active defenders of the building, but there's also a custodian, his wife, and their daughter. And historically, the thing that ends the game is that the Germans bring in a fire truck, they use it to douse the basement of the building with gasoline, and then they set it on fire, and they basically will burn everybody alive if they don't give up. And so, of course, the defenders finally surrender. Well, before that happens, a few of the people inside the building are able to escape. And so in the game, despite it's only sort of like, it contributes to the success of the game, but what any sane, rational human will want to do is make absolutely sure that the non-combatants escape, right? Because that's what you're put in the position as a player to do. And so I think that the thing that resonates with players is trying to the history leading to this key sort of thing that I'm trying to evoke or convey. And I try to make it as simple as possible from a gameplay perspective, right? So if my goal is to always err on the side of simplicity whenever possible. So I only layer on complexity when I feel like it's absolutely necessary to do so. And so I think that combinations of things has led to its relative success.
So the next question is sort of interesting because it poses, how does your creative process or your research question or model differ when approaching or designing a game that is hypothetical in the actual campaign, like sort of like a alternative history, or versus an actual skirmish at a level battle that has actually happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. You just don't have to be constrained by the historical situation, right? So, the most challenging thing about modeling a historic battle is determining whether or not what actually happened in the battle was the most likely thing to have happened, right? So sometimes there's an easy answer. The one I just talked about, Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms, there's no chance that the defenders were ever going to win that battle. There's zero chance. And I don't think they would mind me saying this. There was a short period of time where Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms was going to be published by Phalanx, and they were super kind and allowed me to go to DVG instead so they could be part of the Valiant Defense series. But when it was going to be with Phalanx for that short period of time, they said, "Oh, well, can you design it so that the defenders win?" And I was like, I don't even know what that means, because there is no winning, right? It's beyond a historic, like it's like ludicrous. So, but to circle back to my actual point, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes a historic result was not the most likely result. And so first you kind of have to determine what was the most likely result. What's the range of results, and make sure that a historical game allows for that. Then there's times where if anybody, let's take Castle Itter. I won't delve into Castle Itter in depth because that's a whole, that would take an hour long because of the insanity of that battle. But what I will say is, you're controlling the defenders in that battle, just like all the other games in Valiant Defense. In the actual battle, the defenders only sustained one casualty. That was to a German officer. But in the game, you will sustain more than one casualty. The game is ahistoric, and it's like that because I need to build up tension in the game, and I need to feel like there's more at stake than there necessarily might have been historically. So that's sort of like a side answer to the question, where I'm not looking for something ahistoric completely, but I want to make sure that the gameplay provides a level of tension that the players get that sense, they get that enjoyment. I've never, I think this is true. I mean, I guess the closest I mentioned Europe Divided in passing, because I haven't really designed a game that's kind of historical, but not based in, historic event, like tightly based. So I don't really know how I would go about doing that necessarily. But when you're designing something like Europe Divided that is informed by historical events, but not constrained by it, right? So anything can happen. I think you do it exactly that. You allow the game to be informed by what's come before, but not controlled by it, and just open up the different spectrum of possibilities. Well, what happened if, I don't know, the Bosnian War didn't happen exactly the way it happened, or whatever, right? So I don't know that I approach it. I guess just the design goal, the end state, is the only thing that's really different. What's the end goal of this? Is it to provide a sort of playground to allow players to change history, or is it to model historical battle and constrain it to the range of possibilities that were likely to have occurred?
So the next question is, what part of the design process do you enjoy the most, or does that change from game to game?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. Man, I don't like, I can tell you the part I don't like. I don't like the that pivot point from the model to the game design if I don't have a system in mind already. I don't like the sort of system discovery part of it, because I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in telling the story and refining it. So like when I'm going from the design phase to the development and playtesting and refine phase, like that's all great. Like I can tweak and even rework some of it. But if I have to come up with a brand new system for the first time to do something, that's not my favorite part. Probably the discovery of the historic research part and identifying the bits that I want the game to be about. That's probably the most, even more than the game development and playing the game and all of that. It's probably the research, the discovery of the historical discovery, if you will.
So I can tell you my part that I do not like, which is the part I'm stuck in with Littoral Commander, is like that final last mile of editing, of like finding commas, and like it's just terrible. It's like my personal hell right now. So I don't know how you do it with so many games. I'm just like, I have one game and it's taking me forever. So will Lanzerath Ridge be ported into a computer digital version like Pavlov's house, or do you expect it not to?
Yeah, it's interesting. So two of the games have digital implementations, Castellitter and Pavlov's house. They're by different video game developers, I guess that's what you call it, different studios, whatever. Both of them came to us asking if they could do it. So I think that's going to continue the case. If someone comes to us and says, hey, I want to do it, then that's probably fine. As of right now, I can't speak for DVG. I'm not the publisher. So, if DVG wants to do anything, more power to them. I don't think they're actively seeking out video game design studios to do digital implementations of games, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So the next question is a bit longer, is how can the Valiant Defense system be generalized for a more systematic situations with two-sided interactive player decisions, or is it restricted to be very asymmetrical situations in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. You can play some of the games in the Valiant Defense with like I want to bold, italicize, underline this variant where you can play opposing sides, but really the attacking side is not, I'll just admit it, I don't think it's that interesting. I typically recommend it when you want to play it with somebody, you want to teach the game to them, it gives you an opportunity to like be engaged and kind of manage the AI, which is super simple anyway, but you can manage it and just teach a player. So that's a good option to have. The Valiant Defense series is about telling the story of one side of a conflict usually, right? And so it depends, there's different levels of different gradations of that, but like I don't even have a variant included in Soldiers and Postmen's uniforms because the attacking side is so disgusting that I would not design a game for that. Now, I know people disagree with me. If they want to take the role of SS and pour gasoline into a building and set it on fire, they can do that, but not in the game I design. So, or they can do it themselves. They can make it up, whatever they want to do. But so these games are, you know, it's about telling the story of the defenders. So I'm not going to say that never will the system be adapted, but I think you would have to make some fairly significant changes. You'd have to do two things. It'd have to be a story that you'd want to tell from both sides, both perspectives. So you'd have to have that goal, and you'd have to convert the attacker's side to something that's allows for a lot more player agency, because right now the player agency on the attacker side in those variants is very limited. So I think it winds up becoming a different game. Some of the most elegant parts of the Valiant Defense series are like the line of sight system that I talked about, right? So it's this dirt simple line of sight system, but the simplicity, part of the reason that it is so simple and it can be so simple is because the defenders are in essentially fixed defensive positions, right? If they could move out into the attacker's position, it would start to complicate how you model a line of sight and how you convey line of sight. So it winds up becoming one of those situations where I would say probably the best solution is play a different game. And I don't mean that flippantly, like there's probably better systems. I mean, Lanzaroth Ridge, there is a combat commander scenario to play Lanzaroth Ridge. So it might be a better model for a 2-player version of that.
So the next question asks, what are some future plans do you have or aspirations for the Valiant Defense series?
Yeah, I get asked about future games a lot. There's some games I want to do personally. Siege of Jodetville, I want to do. I've thought about trying to. So historically, people have asked, does Valiant Defense have to be World War II? It doesn't have to be. Though, like I mentioned at the front, you know, when you're digging into these like individual people, I mean, if you look at the counters, you probably noticed almost every counter has the actual photograph of the defender, right? You start to lose, if you go back further than World War II, you start to lose all of this closeness at the skirmish level with the individual people that you have access to. So going back further is a little bit of a challenge. There's also a sense of scale. I like to have the skirmish level scale in the system. The system doesn't have to have that. That's just my personal preference. And I can say that, so Siege of Jodetville, I would like to do. I would like to maybe explore the Battle of Mortain. Maybe a different system is better for that. But with the system, the next game in the system, Volume 5, is going to be announced within the next few days, essentially whenever the designer wants to announce it. It's not me. I'm not the designer for it. Vince Cooper is. I won't tell what it's about because that's that should be his time to tell. But I will say that Vince has done some really interesting things. I think he's publicly teased this, so I can say this. Lots and lots and lots of people love Pavlov's house. They like the different scales that it combines, and Vince is revisiting that with his design. And he's also changing the overall scale of some of the defenders. So he is pushing it in new and interesting ways that it hasn't gone before. So that's cool. So I almost certainly will do more games in the series. Vince, I think, has more ideas probably in the future, and it's opened up for other people too. So I think that, you know, it has plenty of room to grow.
So next question asks, how does a game that simulates only a single battle differ from a system that accommodates multiple scenarios? And how do you tackle that as a designer?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's lots of lots of the key enablers that we talked about in Pavlov's house come into play big time about how you manage those and what proportion of the game design they should take when you have multiple engagements that you're dealing with, right? So, for example, in Pavlov's house, there's an option, there's a variant that you can play where it introduces these cards are called, I think they're called operational support, I think is what it's called. And what they do is it's just an individual card, and it's like, it's all these very, very famous portions of Stalingrad, other parts of the battle, right? So like the steelworks, for example. And the only thing it does in the game is it says, hey, the steelworks are over here and they want these resources. They want you to allocate these resources to them. And if you do so, you're going to score some victory points. But if you allocate those resources, the resources are finite. And if you do that, then you can't send them to the defenders of Pavlov's house. So that was a way that I was able to the extreme high level abstraction, the tension of that army, command post resource allocation tension. But to circle back to answer the actual question about it, deciding which elements that you want to exist in the design and to what degree, that's the complicating thing. I'm working on a concept right now where it's multiple different units moving across a sort of a country level scale, and it's like, well, where's the game at? Is it the action, the tactical action of the independent units happening at different times? Is it the higher level command and control, or the higher level logistics? And so you just have to make a decision, and it can be one of those, right? It can be a strategic game where you're managing command and control, or it can be a tactical game where you're diving deep into it. Or you can maybe get away with something like what Pavlov's house does, where you can focus on one and abstract the other. But I think it's a fool's errand to try to be everything to everybody and try to model various different levels in detail. I think that's just too much. So I'm not sure if I actually answered the question. I went a little of a tangent there, but maybe.
Yeah, no worries. I guess the next question that I am grateful to Cody for asking is, what advice do you have for aspiring game designers?
Yeah. So one piece of advice I hear a lot, I didn't do this. I kind of, in retrospect, maybe wish I had, would do like iterations of existing designs is probably a good idea. I wasn't smart enough at the time to try that, so I didn't do that. So there's series games like Coin Games or Valiant Defense or whatever that are games that you can either dabble with just to learn, or you could dabble with as, hey, I have an idea for an engagement or battle or whatever. I'll use this system, and potentially it goes on to get published. So that's one option. That's a relatively easy approach instead of trying to recreate something completely. But the one piece of advice that I'll absolutely give, this is my actual answer to the question: find a mentor. I'm super happy to I only have so much time in the world, so I can't mentor everybody and spend tons of time doing it. But tons of people have reached out to me as they're getting started, and they ask questions that are design questions that are, do you know anything about this publisher? Can you help me with a contract? There are many people in our hobby who are awesome people who will absolutely take the time to help you, to coach you, to mentor you. Almost everybody in our hobby is super friendly. So the one piece of advice I would say is to reach out to people and just ask for help, right? That's the number one thing I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I don't think there are any other questions, so I want to thank you on the behalf of the Georgetown University Wargames Society for your time, your generosity, and your expertise, especially on a Tuesday evening in the summer where you can be like sipping a beer out on your porch or something. So I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan of the series, a big fan of your game design, and I know this is, given all the comments and already all the thanks in the chat, that people will really appreciate this. So for those of you who stuck with us all the way to the end, really appreciate you, and thank you for all the wonderful questions. And again, thank you, David. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. This was awesome.